Okay.
Okay, so I'll let you start, and this is very informal, but we're here to learn from you what you've experienced during your time in the American workplace.
Okay. Well, Sunroad is a family-owned company.
Right.
We're a private company, and it was started by my father when we moved from Mexico to the States in 1977.
Okay.
So it's an opportunistic company, and the United States is a great place if you're able to be opportunistic.
Right.
My father was part of a family business before. He had worked with his father, and so I'm really third generation in this.
So was the business Sunroad established initially in Mexico before it came to the United States?
No, Sunroad was incorporated in the U.S., but
Okay,
in Mexico, there were other businesses that were family businesses.
I got you. Okay. So all along, at least two generations, three generations, it's been entrepreneurial.
Correct.
Oh, very good.
Correct. And so real estate has been a part of it from the beginning. Then
Okay.
the auto dealerships became a part of it in 1984. In 85 is when it started. And then in 1987, the US changed the tax code with the Tax Reform Act of 87.
Right.
And originally, real estate was a great shelter for an operating business. And the rules changed so that that was no longer the case. But at that point, we were already in the business. So the
Okay.
business continued to grow on both sides.
Now, my
On
understanding, if I remember correctly, and I read something about your father, that one of the reasons that he went into the auto business was from a cash flow perspective. In other words, it was generating cash immediately, whereas some of the land developments took a longer time to generate cash. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, I mean, they are non-correlated businesses,
Right.
which which is good to have. And so the real estate tends to be uses cash for a long time, and then you have a big appreciation in value once you hit your next step in the development, whatever
Right.
that is. The dealerships don't tend to have those big swings, right? It tends to not be as great a upside or as bad a downside. So
Okay.
it was good to have a complementary cash flowing business that could help cover some of the
So
expenses.
it provided some balance, if you will.
Right. We don't really have outside investors.
Okay.
And what other real estate companies do for that is they just charge fees, right? So they'll have
Hmm.
investment, they charge a fee based on your investment. That's how they cover their cash flow. Since we
Okay.
outside investors, we didn't have fees. We needed to find other ways of covering our fixed expenses.
Okay. So when did you enter the scene?
Well, I entered the scene when I was a student still. This was one of the places where I had summer jobs, and I worked here throughout college. So when
Uh-huh.
I was to UCSD, I would either work part-time or full-time, depending on whether it was breaks or during the year,
Uh-huh.
the academic year. And then I left for about 10 years, and I came back around 2001.
So what
And
did you do for that 10-year period of time?
went to work in Mexico. I worked outside of the family business, so I was an
Okay.
investment banker with different financial institutions. I also went up to the Bay Area and got a master's in business at Stanford, and went back to Mexico to work some more. Came back up to the Bay Area, founded a company with some classmates of mine. Replaced myself as CEO of that company, and then came back here to Sunroad after about 10 years.
Now, was it always in the family plans for you to do something outside of Sunroad before you came back permanently?
I don't know that it was discussed exactly that way.
Uh-huh.
It was more that I was working outside of the family business when there was sufficient need for me to come back, and it was actually a little bit the same path my father had, which is he worked outside of the family business also for a bunch of years before it was appropriate for him to come back. So,
Yeah, I don't know if Stella's told you, but I work with a lot of entrepreneurs. And
uh-huh.
one of the things that the founders, if you will, or the senior people in the organization have recommended for their subsequent family members is go see what it's like on the outside. Get some of the great ideas, but also get exposed to other experiences other than embedding yourself in the family business entirely. And they've always felt that that was a plus for the family to have had that outside perspective. Did you find that beneficial as well?
Yeah, I think it's beneficial for two reasons. One is obviously you get a different work experience, and so it broadens your horizons. But the other one is I think it makes a difference. It made a difference for me as an individual. So being able to be outside of the family business and achieve things.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're achieving things inside the family business, there's never a chip on the shoulder about, is this only because I happen to have the right last name,
Gotcha.
or or are these true achievements. And
Uh-huh.
me having gone to different universities and having been involved in different businesses and gotten growth opportunities and promotions and those types of achievements help solidify the fact that our my position isn't just because I have the right last name.
Oh, good for you. Well, it probably made you feel good too, though, didn't it?
It did, absolutely.
Yeah, because a lot of times, I think you're right. One of the folks that I'm working with, you've probably heard of Sombrero, Mexican foods. Well,
Okay.
I'm coaching the current president, who's the son of the father of the grandfather.
Okay.
And what's interesting is he's done nothing else but be in the restaurant business at Sombrero. And
Okay.
so he hired me to come in and say, Larry, you got to tell me what goes on besides my family business. So we've
Right.
worked a lot on that just so he gets experience that's outside of it.
Right.
Uh, and it's really interesting to me because it's fascinating to see founders. I've taught entrepreneurship in several universities, and it's a fun thing to work with entrepreneurs. I've never really been one.
Right.
I work for myself now, but in more of a consultative, coaching capacity. So as you've gone through your work experiences, both inside and outside of Sunroad, uh, tell me a little bit about what you've learned and seen along the way, Uri, about changes in the workplace from both a what I'll call a management style standpoint. Has management style, as you viewed it over time, changed dramatically over the 20 plus years that you've been working?
Yeah, there's been a lot of changes in the workplace. Partially, it is just the rules keep changing, which makes it very difficult. For instance, the way wages are calculated or not calculated, the way you have to pay base pay versus commissions keeps changing, and in California particularly, the rules are very hard to follow,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have consistency in guidance from the different agencies that oversee it.
Right.
And so, what that does is it allows for a litigation type of culture where
Mm-hmm.
if something goes wrong, rather than having a resolution mechanism internally, it starts with formal complaints and filings and outside lawyers, and so that is, I think, not helpful. It's not helpful
No.
for the associate, and it's not helpful for the business.
I think
Um,
the ones who benefit from that are the attorneys, though.
Pretty much, and they are very involved in making sure these rules get written that way. Uh, so that's been very difficult. We do business in Mexico still, and I'm very involved in business in Mexico, and the rules keep changing there as well.
Is
And
it easier in Mexico than California?
oh yeah, I don't think I think it's probably tough to find a place that's harder than California. You
Really?
know,
Okay.
I'll give you a small example. So in the car business, the way you pay people typically is commission based,
Right.
right? You sell more, you make more, and
Mm-hmm.
it's unlimited. You can make as much as you want. Just depends on how much you sell.
Right.
But the way California has forced a change is it used to be that you would pay somebody a minimum wage towards their commission, so that at least if they worked the hours, they got paid for the hours they were there, but you applied it against their commission.
Was it kind of like a draw?
And the California said you can't do draws anymore. You
Oh,
can't do draws
really?
commission. The hour that you work have to be paid as hours. and the commission plan has to be separate. And so it's hard for the person who's working to calculate what they're really going to make. It's hard for us to calculate what they really should make. It
Mm-hmm.
forces us to tell them to go home at a certain time, because otherwise they start falling into overtime calculations, because the way California calculates your overtime isn't just based on your base pay, it's based on your total take home. So what is the total take home if you have a commission program?
Wow. I never thought about it
It
that
forces
way.
it actually takes away a lot of the entrepreneurship of people
Right.
to manage their own careers. And if I want to work harder, I get to work harder,
Right.
right? Pushes us to say, I'm sorry, you can't stay here any longer.
And that
You have to
just
go
goes
home.
against that goes against the grain, doesn't it, Uri, of a good salesman?
Correct.
Oh
And
my
so
God.
now you have established a confrontational relationship with your associate, because you're telling them, I know you're working something, go home, I'll see you tomorrow.
Oh my
Hand it off
gosh.
to somebody else, because we have to take over, we're not going to drop the customer. They're
Right.
saying, no, wait, I got this. Let me finish. And you're saying, I'm sorry. California says you don't got this.
Oh, you don't.
You need your rest. But I want to make these choices. Well, you're not allowed to make these choices, or you are allowed to make these choices, but now you're in a tough spot and we're in a tough spot because you're now generating overtime
In
in a
the
very
restaurant industry, which I came from, Uri, you're allowed to pay sub minimum wage, and as long as the tips that they take brings them above minimum wage. But the only
correct.
thing they're required to pay is overtime if it goes over 8 hours or over 40 hours in a week. So it's a lot simpler than what you just articulated.
No, it's very difficult. And in the restaurant business, you see that one of the big discrepancies that happen is that tips only go to the front of the house.
Well, that's changing.
It's changing, but you have to do tips in a different way.
Right. And now it's a shared pool based upon hours worked, which I find much better for teamwork.
It makes a lot of sense, but you have to set up the tipping system, as you know, in a different way
Mm-hmm.
than you
Right.
had before. So those are things that I think are make it difficult to be fully aligned with your team. And I think that it is very important for companies to be able to take care of their associates. I also think that
Right.
it's very important for companies to be able to motivate and align with their associates. And when
Mm-hmm.
you have too much regulation that drives a wedge between that, then that's unfortunately a very hard system to navigate.
It really is. Now, I assume that in Mexico, no such constraints exist.
Well, in Mexico, it's different. In Mexico, the minimum wages are much lower.
Right.
Uh, the ability to pay commission is better, but in Mexico, one of the things that happens is you can't really lower somebody's wage. It's not the same way that in the States, where you can have a fully variable wage,
Mm-hmm.
and so that makes it very difficult. In Mexico, if you have to let an employee go, there are complicated calculations as to seniority and how long they've been there, and there's always a severance that gets paid, um, and it's just a calculation you have to manage. But one of the things you'll find, and you might have seen it if you're in the restaurant business, is Mexican restaurants will be way overstaffed compared to U.S. restaurants,
Right.
and that's because you can afford to, right? So the other part of it is that in Mexico, you tend to have a more, I'll call it a more professional workforce, in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that they are looking at it as their profession.
Yes. Yes.
So whereas in the States, oftentimes people are very portable, where
Mm-hmm.
their college job is different than what the job they're hoping to get afterwards, and might be a stepping stone. And they especially in the food service industry, it might just be a job while they get another job. In Mexico, you'll find people who are going to be a professional waiter or a professional salesperson,
Mm-hmm.
or for their career, and they are investing in it as a profession. And so that allows you to develop them better and
Uh-huh.
differently, because they're invested in it
Do
and
you think
vested in it.
do you think that change in attitude towards being a professional in any venue that you're in has been driven by the fact that employers have in the US have taken a different look at employees? There was a belief back in the 40s that you were going to be with an employer forever. And as the 50s came along, it started to shift. And in the 60s, it was kind of like employees weren't seen as a major asset. They were seen as a very disposable, cost, if you will. And so employees were encouraged to look at themselves, if you will, as Larry Destro Inc. And I'm available to anybody who's willing to pay the highest bidder, if you will. So I'm wondering if what's occurred, at that economic level has caused a change in attitude towards what the professional level looks like.
Yeah, I don't know that I know enough or have thought deeply enough about the reasons why that happens in the States. I
Uh-huh.
do think there's a lot of mobility in the States, which might also affect it, where,
Mhm.
I think the last statistic I saw is that people will move 7 times in their lives, but not just houses, cities. So
Yeah,
if you're that mobile, it forces you to have your relationships be very different in any case. It's different relationships with friends as well as with careers.
right. Very good. So management styles, have you seen management styles change over your time in the business world?
Yeah, absolutely. We tend to be very transparent with our teams,
Hmm.
and I think that there is definitely a trend towards that, where we're going to share all the information with the people on the front lines,
Right,
because they're the ones who know how to make the decisions with the customer. So we have to empower them to do it,
right.
which is a little different than it used to be, a little bit more dictatorial, I would say, and hierarchical, which is, here's your script and just go do your script.
Yeah, and everything was close to the vest.
Correct. And so I don't think we look at things that way.
Okay.
Um, well, I know we definitely don't look at things that way, but
Uh,
it's also something that, I don't think it as a trend people are being as, secretive. I don't know if that's the right
I think it
way of
is.
looking
Yeah.
at it. But definitely, it's people are being much more transparent about it, and
Hmm.
you also hear about it with the decisions that are made. So whenever a decision is made, it's surprising when it's a surprise to anybody, because it's been vetted and spoken
Right.
about, pretty clearly beforehand.
So you talked about teamwork there. Would you say that there's at Sunroad, a lot of inclusion in decisions that are being made up and down the organization?
Yeah. So, to give you an idea, when we have our monthly numbers meetings,
Uh-huh.
it's not me and our head of a department, and and our head of the, for instance, the head of the auto division and the general manager. We will have every manager in the room, right?
Okay.
And let all of them hear, even if it's not your area. So the sales guys will hear what service talks about, the service guys hear what parts talks about. It's everybody's understanding how the whole business is flowing for the most part. Now, it might not be applicable to them in the same way, but it helps them work as teams if they know what everybody else's goals are as well.
Hmm. Yeah, it seemed to me that would, in particularly in the auto dealership arena, that there's a cross referral, if you will. If you're buying a car, you want to make sure people know about your parts department and your maintenance department, so that they go back and forth, and the people working on my engine say, "Hey, might be time to get a new car. You want to talk to our sales guy," so that there is some symbiotic relationships
There definitely is, but if you talk to the old time car guys, they tell you, well, I would never have everybody in the room. If I have to talk to sales, I get the salesperson,
there. Yeah.
and if I have to talk to service, I get the service person, and that's it, right? So, you're talking about changes in management style. I think transparency and inclusiveness is now something that we don't even think about.
Hmm.
It's an absolute, and it's taken for granted.
So I'm going to ask you now one of the questions from one of my students. She's from Japan, and she wants to know how difficult is it to manage a diversified multinational business?
It's very difficult.
I want more of an answer than that, Odie.
All right. So I'll give you my personal experience. When I
Okay.
was, in business school,
Uh-huh.
I thought that I could be a Latin American businessman, and so I got a job afterwards. I worked in Brazil and I worked in Colombia, and And I did some work in Honduras and in Mexico as obviously. And what I found is that there is no such thing as a Latin American businessman. You're either a Brazilian businessman or a Mexican business person or a Colombian business person or it's an oversimplification to say whatever region you are. And I'm sure, Japan, it's the same concept of saying you're not an Asian business person.
Right.
You're Japanese or Korean or Chinese or Vietnamese or whatever country you happen to be in. And an example of that is in Mexico, we have a tradition, which is a very polite tradition, which is I will give you the bad news in person,
Okay.
not say by Zoom or by phone.
Right.
So I've had the situation where I go visit a store and they tell me that they've almost found the replacement for the service manager who left. You say, oh, when did the service manager leave? Oh, about 2 weeks ago. And you say, well, we spoke 2 weeks ago and last week and this week. And they said, yeah, but I knew you were coming. So I wanted to tell you in person. Right. So bad news is it's not hidden, but it's given in person. In the
Okay.
US, you're much more used to uh, being completely open and transparent on the phone. There's no difference if I'm talking to you on the phone or by Zoom or in person, right?
Uh-huh.
The chit chat might be a little different, but there's no filter that gets added because we're not sitting across the table from each other.
Now,
And so
do you think the fact that pandemics come along, has that changed any of your behaviors, or have you still tried to do the in-person conversations?
I'm still trying to do the in person because I know culturally you can't change things that quickly.
Okay.
I think that things are changing, definitely.
Mhm.
But I think that for countries like Mexico, it's been a little tougher because of these communication issues. So what I find is in Mexico, you have a lot more calls and meetings and Zooms to try and get to the nuance. So when you
Uh,
call somebody and you say, is everything, how are things? And they say, fine, you have to be able to understand if fine is fine or if fine means dig a little deeper. Why just
right.
fine?
Right.
No, 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 it's fine. Really, right? I have an uncle who used to joke that in Mexico was the land of no thank you. That if you were dying for an ice cream and somebody offered you an ice cream, you say no, 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 thank you. Hey, no, really, would you like one? Well, I insist. Yes, I would love one. Right. So the first answer was always, I don't want to impose. Right. It's about my
Gotcha.
take. And so until you know the rhythm of it,
Uh-huh. Well,
hard to do
I
so.
learned something doing business in Japan, that
Mhm.
yes didn't mean yes.
Right. Yes, I heard you.
Yes means I'm going to think about it.
Right.
And you can hear yes a second time and you're still, Americans, okay, we're ready to move forward. And they're still thinking about it. It's not until it's almost their idea coming back to you and they fully embraced the whole concept and kind of massaged it the way they wanted to, that then you can say, we're ready to move forward. But that was a real learning experience for me because I'm a guy that says, if you say yes, we're moving today. We're
Right.
not waiting until tomorrow. We're moving today. And so I've done business. I don't know if Stella told you, I was the president of Baskin Robbins and Dunkin' Donuts worldwide. And so I was doing
Oh,
business in 70 countries. And every country, well, first of all, was like going to Disneyland because I love the different cultures. But the second thing that was fascinating to me is just how business, like you've said, is done very differently. And what's polite in one country is not the same expectation in another. I had to do studying every time I go to a new country. What is the things that I can and can't do? Because it was like, I better not make a faux pas because I could ruin a business relationship.
correct. And so things as simple as how you greet somebody,
Mm-hmm.
right, is very important. In Mexico, uh, women and men and women will still greet each other with a kiss.
Yep.
Now this is pre-COVID, right? But there's still now a very awkward dance when you see someone when you know that you should and shouldn't. In the U.S. now, what I'm seeing is people will fist bump, right,
Mm-hmm.
where before they would give a hand. In Mexico, that becomes much more awkward because women and women or men and women were used to a, a greeting that that was very different.
Right.
And if you are an American and you're showing up in Mexico and you don't understand how that works, all of a sudden it gets very awkward,
Yeah, I
right?
have
And
a funny story about the kisses. Is that when I went to Ecuador, it was the first place I went where they kissed on both cheeks. And so my franchisee's wife came up, and all of a sudden, I didn't know which way to go. And she kissed me on one cheek and then the other, and I felt so embarrassed, Uri. But then I realized I hadn't done my homework on that one. That was just the tradition.
right. So those are the obvious things that come out. Below that, there's a lot of subtlety,
Right.
which is very important, and it's important who says what to whom. So sometimes it's easier for me not to be in a conversation.
Hmm.
Other times it's better for me to be in the conversation, and in the U.S. there's less sensitivity to those questions.
Right.
I tell you, in Latin America there's more sensitivity to those situations, and so how you manage a international workforce is different.
Now, how about hierarchically? Is the hierarchy in Mexico more formal than the one in the US, would you say, Uri?
Yes, definitely.
So if I'm a subordinate, let's say 3 levels removed from the president, if you will, is it likely that I'm going to just be friendly with this guy and be able to offer my ideas, or not very likely?
No, you
Mexico.
can still do that. It's about how the questions are asked and when the
Okay.
questions are asked and how they're posed. That's not really an issue. And I get about, I would say, as many letters or emails in Mexico about people 2 or 3 or 4 levels down that want to share things with me as I
Oh,
do in.
good.
So that's not really the issue. But Mexico, Spanish in general has a more formal conjugation and a less
Hmm.
formal conjugation. So there's the usted versus the tú,
Right.
Mexico, and in vos in other places. And um, hierarchies are very obvious even in how you address somebody, right?
Okay.
So people who are older than me will address me in a more deferential tone just because of the hierarchy, and I'll address them in a more deferential tone because of age, right? So it's not only hierarchy; it's also social hierarchies. I would say
So
that
is that a matter of respect?
it's a matter of respect,
Okay.
but it doesn't. But it's not a matter of transparency or openness, right? So they'll still be able to say, "I have this concern and I have these issues." It's just said in in a manner of respect.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let me ask you another student question, because some of them were fascinating to me. While you were in college, what were your career aspirations?
Well, I had the good fortune when I was in college to study what I was interested in, right? It wasn't necessarily that I came in knowing that I was 100% focused on a specific career.
Uh,
And I think that one of the great advantages of going to college in the United States is that it opens up your perspective, your horizon.
mhm.
What I found is that a lot of people who I very much admire, uh, that I studied with, and a lot of people who I've spoken to that were generations ahead of me, most of the ones who are very happy aren't necessarily doing what they studied to do,
Yeah,
right? So,
one of them.
I would say that having had the blessing of being able to study what I was interested in, regardless of whether it was specifically focused on a career, really broadened my horizons in my education. And when I went to work right out of college and I went to Mexico, my degree, I had from UCSD, I majored in economics and
Right.
had minors in biology, chemistry, and Judaic studies. And um, what I found was that my contemporaries who were just starting out their jobs at the same time I was were actually better trained than I was,
Hmm.
but I was better educated than them. So when they were doing something that they were trained to do, they could get it much quicker because they'd already seen it.
Right.
We were both faced with something that neither of us knew how to do. I was able to get it much quicker because I had been educated. I had been taught to figure it out, right? Being given partial information and then had to get the tools right and go from there. And so that allowed me, I think, to progress further than some of my classmates faster, just because the education system was really less training and more education, I would say.
Was that because of the breadth of your education, you think, as opposed to going deep in a discipline, you spread out across multiple disciplines?
No, I mean, I think I spread out across multiple because I could within within the requirements that the university had.
Uh-huh.
Um, because I still, I mean, within economics, I did an honors thesis and I went pretty deep within economics. But what
Okay.
I found was, people would ask me, what does biology, chemistry, and economics have in common? Why are you
Right.
doing that? And the way I would look at it is, at the end of the day, what you're being faced with is a problem or situation.
Mm-hmm.
Told what the information is that you know, and then it's go figure it out. So in one case, it was go figure it out within the messy world of economics. Another case might be within the messy world of biology. But
Okay.
the bottom line of it is it's still approached as a science, right? A social science versus
Interesting.
a physical science or natural science. And in Mexico, what I found was that a lot of my contemporaries were learning a trade, right? Even if they were being educated in finance or they were being
Mm-hmm.
educated in economics, they were being educated in applied economics. And here's how you do
Gotcha.
it. Here's here's how you apply the models and go and do it. And it wasn't really dig into why this makes sense, dig
Mm-hmm.
into why are we thinking this way. And I
Interesting.
had fabulous professors at UCSD. In statistics and in econometrics and such, but they were teaching me the tools, not training me.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. Because a lot of the criticisms of education today, depending on either the university or even the I call the elementary school system, is that we teach to memorize as opposed to teach to think. And one of my favorite professors was Peter Drucker. You probably heard of Peter Drucker. And I'll give you a quick anecdote. I took a course in a PhD program from Peter, and he gave a business problem. And he posed the problem, and then he asked if anybody had a solution. Now, all of us were executives in there, so it wasn't like we were, freshmen. We all had MBAs, and we were really thought we were brilliant, right? Nobody raised their hand except me. And so I raised my hand and I volunteered what I thought was an exceptional explanation to the solution of this problem. He ripped me a new one for 20 minutes, Uri. And I realized then why nobody raised their hand in Peter Drucker's class. But his
Right.
point was, I don't want you to think about the surface issues. I want you to go deep and think about the underlying causes, and then you can solve the problem. But if you attack the surface issues, you may not solve the problem. You just may get rid of some of the things that initially caused it, but you didn't get to the root cause. And forever, I will remember that man for teaching me that one thing.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, you raised your hand. You probably learned that better than
absolutely. Than the ones who didn't.
taught.
What kind of advice, Uri, would you give students who wish to pursue a business career? What kind of counsel would you say, okay, young students who are coming out of either an undergraduate or an MBA program, what kind of counsel would you give them about pursuing a business career?
Well, I think that people should look at themselves as entrepreneurs, even if
Okay.
you're working within a company. And I read I'm reading a book right now by John Doerr called Measure What Matters.
I'm reading it too.
All right. Well, there's a part in it where he defines an entrepreneur. He's
OKR, right?
it's OKRs exactly. But and the way he describes it is, he says an entrepreneur is somebody who achieves more with less resource, more than you think possible, with less resources than you would think are necessary.
Uh-huh.
He says maybe the flip side of that is a bureaucrat who achieves less than you think should be achievable with more resources than are necessary.
Uh-huh.
I think that's how you have to think about it. Look at opportunities, put yourself in an ownership position as far as owning the problem that you're trying to solve, or the
Mm-hmm.
department, or the opportunity that you're involved with. And if you do that, then you're going to continue to get more opportunities.
So if I'm a student and I'm interviewing with you, what do you look for in me as a potential job applicant?
Well, our culture is one where I'm looking for stability,
Okay.
right, and longevity. So I can find some very smart people, but if they've only been, 4 months in the job, then they switched, and then 1 year, and it's 2 years, and it's 1 year, and 2 years, then one of the questions I ask is why, right? Is it really I achieved my goal? Maybe there's a good story, right? But maybe there isn't. And it just, when the pattern is this is somebody who can't keep a path, it's a working with people, it's a focus, it's a capabilities question in
Mm-hmm.
my so I'll dig deeper into those types of questions. So that's one thing I'm looking at. The other thing is someone who has excelled at the different things that they have done. So is it somebody who gets more and more and more responsibilities, or is it somebody who stays at the same responsibility? And obviously it depends what job I'm looking at, but generally I'm looking for somebody who shows growth within places. Now,
Gotcha.
um, in the other piece of advice, it also comes from a book I read, which is Bob Iger's biography right now called Ride of a Lifetime. He says that one of the pieces of advice he got was don't be a trombone oil salesman. Says you might make the best trombone oil in the world, but there might be a gallon of need in the entire world in a year. So don't focus your energies on things that aren't big picture
I'll be done.
um, growth. Now, that doesn't mean everybody has to go work for the Googles of the world.
Right.
What it means is make sure that if you're spending your time, you're spending your time in something that you agree is impactful, right? That you agree is great. And so when I have people who come to work for me, and the reason they want to come work with us is for the paycheck. I understand everybody should be working for a paycheck, but it's
Right.
very different. You have somebody that their only motivation is the paycheck, and what the way I measure that is at the end of every interview, I'll ask for questions.
Mm-hmm.
What can I answer for you? And it's clear to me when somebody's questions are all about, what are the benefits and how many days off do I get
Right.
and what time do I get to leave, and versus questions about the business
Right.
and about how are we going to grow the business and where else do you see opportunities and what are the things that keep you up at night?
Mm-hmm.
Questions like that are probing questions
Right.
that show that you're really interested in and can be a partner for me in helping further our business.
Right. Very good. Very good. Are there new skills required in the emerging workforce that are different than perhaps the workforce that you entered as a undergraduate? In other words, what are we coming to the game with today, or that we need today to be successful that maybe we didn't need 20, 30 years ago?
Well, I think a couple things. One of them is things just work quicker,
Mm-hmm.
right? So before, information just took longer. So you're expected to be quicker to decide, quicker to react, quicker to absorb information than people were 20 years ago. The second part of it is that it's expected, I think, now that you'll do your own analysis. Whereas before, when people were entering a job, they might be the analyst, and that
Mm-hmm.
was the actual title. You're an
Right.
analyst. You give the information to someone who would make decisions, even though there's still analyst type of jobs out there.
Right.
The decision makers are doing their own analysis, and they might rely on other people to help them put things together, but there's a lot of iteration that happens, which is, no, let's look at the spreadsheet this way, or you know what, just give me the information and I'll build my own model and I'll give it to you to refine.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that happens. So for instance, in our particular case, um, as a private company, we really care about cash flow,
Absolutely.
and I have rebuilt our cash flow model, I would say, two different times in the last 5 years where I rebuilt it. And I gave it to our CFO or to our accounting staff and said, here's how I want you to show it to me, right? Not that the old one didn't give the information, but
Right.
now I look at it this way because it's more applicable for me. rather than just saying, you know, go build me a new one, and here's the things. The first draft of it was me building it, right? And so what I think is, um, people should be more in touch with data, more in touch with how to manipulate data, and be thinking that you're going to have to continue to do this moving forward, rather than expecting it to be analyzed for you.
So one of the things that I'm a firm believer in, and I coach young startup entrepreneurs, is act with your gut, but verify with data. And it really speaks to your point. You better analyze the data about the decision you're about to act on with your gut to make sure that it makes economic and business sense. And too often they'll either do one or the other, but not both. Because a lot of times you're right. You're right down here and you know you're right. But it's nice to know that you've got data to back that up. But the other thing I don't want to be stuck with is what I call analysis paralysis. Okay, let's get it at least 80 or 90%. Let's move. Let's make a decision. Let's not, forego making a decision because I need just a little more data. So I like your thing that people need to be their own analysts. I think that's great advice.
Yeah, but and that was why the first part of it is also you have to make decisions quicker.
Mm-hmm.
It happens, and it's okay to iterate,
Yep.
but someone who is not able to make decisions, I think, is going to be at a big disadvantage in the world to come, because just analyzing data, you're always going to be at a disadvantage to the machine, right? But making decisions is where the true brilliance for the human is.
Very good. Very good. In terms of growth in your business model in particular, what's important to maintain sustainable growth? What's important to your business to maintain sustainable growth?
Well, there's a lot of external things that are important, right? We have to not be over-regulated. We
Mm-hmm.
have One of the conversations I often have whenever I have to speak with politicians is saying to them, I don't care what the box is, just tell me what the rules are. The issue that business has is when rules keep changing, right? So you will set something up with the expectation that this is the sandbox we have to play with, and then they move the rules. Now, that's different than understanding that objectives keep changing and, who moved my cheese type of
Right,
questions.
right.
This is more when the government, for instance, if you're designing a building, we're in the real estate business, and you design it based on the rules, and then at the end they come back and they said, oh, we've now decided that you need to have a different affordable housing component or a different park component, so then it's throwaway work what you did, because now it doesn't fit.
Right.
It's not like I can build that and then iterate. And so that's one of the frustrations that I think exists in the world. And what we're seeing is that there's especially in California, a move towards overregulation. And sometimes it is well-meaning regulation, but it is not well thought out, and the unintended consequences aren't explored. So, for instance, in California, there was recently a study that's about San Diego where they looked at the cost of a house. Everybody's concerned about cost of housing, and something like 40% of a cost of a house is regulation and permits.
Really?
Yeah. So
no, you're serious.
You just remove that to exaggerate, you drop the cost of housing to 60%.
Oh my gosh.
So that's one of the things that I think is an impediment to growth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's part of the reason why some of the only businesses that have really grown in California tend to be more digital businesses, right? Where those rules either aren't applied to them, they're too far behind to actually apply to them, or
Right.
only apply to the California citizens, but most of your market is outside of California. I think that the opportunities, though, are we have a very affluent country. There's a lot of division and such, but if you look at the percentage of people living in poverty in the United States, and you look at the disposable income, I mean, things like cell phones, right? Cell phones we now look at them as necessities, but they're not really a necessity. It's a luxury to be able to have, and we choose to have a lot of disposable income, that brings a ton of opportunities, right? Now, if you can do it in a responsible way, then I think your opportunities are even magnified. So you do things that are sustainable, you do things um, that are touching the trends that are happening with regards to the desires of people.
Mhm.
Um, I think the great advantage is now those markets have truly opened up.
Very good point. So I'm going to ask you the next question. And this one here came from my Herman is his name. He's my attorney from Mexico. And what he said is, what is your most lucrative business sector? And what are the different effects of COVID on those two sectors or those sectors?
Well, I would say that there's timing questions. You know, real estate is lucrative based on timing
Right.
because you have sales, and right now the especially the multifamily real estate business um, has been very attractive. Uh, COVID in that market has not had a huge effect, right? Now, partially it's because people need housing. And
Mhm.
so in the United States, the government has put a few $1 trillion into the economy, and people have basically used it to pay their bills.
Right.
So the question is really what's going to happen in the future, and how's that going to play out? But for the most part, right now, the lending markets have kept lending. The interest rates have been kept low by the government. Currencies are flowing, and therefore uh, COVID has had a greater cost impact on that because PPE and distancing and cleaning and things like that.
Right.
But the business has continued to flow pretty well.
Okay. Now, how about on the auto business?
On the auto side is one of the examples where things have been different between Mexico and the US. In Mexico, it's been a lot tougher, partially because the government didn't have a few $1 trillion to put into the economy.
Mm-hmm.
In the US, um, uh, people have shifted largely from being willing to share rides as much and take public transportation to needing their own transportation. So that's been good.
Interesting.
In Mexico, the government has been a little bit more um, inconsistent with openings and closings. It
Right.
really has relied on the states doing those things and not given that much federal guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our situation, it's kind of depended on whether the government was opening or not in the different areas. And it did not provide the stimulus dollars that, or pesos in that case, that the US did. And so that has made people react in a very different way. So we are part of the retail sector there, where auto is being treated very much uh, like general retail, whereas in the US it's treated a little bit more like transportation.
Oh, interesting. So you would say that in the US, then you have a more favorable climate to continue your business operations in the auto industry than in Mexico.
That's correct.
Okay, interesting. So has it returned to any degree of normalcy here in the US, or is it still suppressed?
Well, in the US, the auto market is probably going to be down 15-20% for the year.
Uh-huh.
In Mexico, it's twice that.
Oh, goodness. Oh, goodness. Is that across all parts of the auto industry down there or just on the sales?
Well, I mean, one of the ways of measuring it is new car sales, right? So
Okay.
the new car market in the US probably went down from, 16 and a half, 17 million units to about 15 million units.
Mm-hmm.
In Mexico, it went down from about 1.5 million units to 900,000 units. So it's a much bigger
Wow, that is big. Going forward, looking into the future, put on your future hat, if you will, for a second. If you looked out and you said, okay, the pandemic has actually created and accelerated some changes in our businesses and in our overall economies, but what would you think about will occur in the future as it relates to the business and the American workplace? And I'll give you an example. There's some futurists that are saying that business offices in general are going to be downsizing because people are going to be moving to the suburbs because remote opportunities to work, from afar are going to be easier than they are today, in the past. So that's a forecast. I don't know that it's going to come true, but it's a forecast. What are your thoughts about, the future of the American workplace and what it might look 10, 15 years
So I heard an interesting interview with the CEO of Marriott,
from now?
who
Okay,
basically said the ability to work from home is fine as a temporary measure, but it is terrible for the long term. The reason for it is because a lot of strategic discussions happen kind of in the water cooler talks, the downtime between meetings, the informal communication that happens. And when everybody's scheduled from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, that doesn't happen. The second part of it is that you can't onboard somebody into your culture remotely, because so much of what we learn is actually learned through the reading of body language, the examples that you see other people working on, and that gets much more difficult if you're not there in person. And so I think that if the United States, first of all, we're going to solve somehow the COVID situation,
I
whether
agree.
it's in a year, in 6 months, in 18 months. At some point, it might be something where people learn to take care of themselves if they're in that risk category. I think of it a little bit like hemophiliacs, right? If you're a hemophiliac, you know that if something happens and you get cut, you have a real issue.
Right.
So don't depend on others to not bump you or cut you. You really protect yourself.
Good
Um,
point.
and I think that's what's going to happen. Any at-risk population is going to learn to defend themselves and protect themselves, and everybody else is going to get back to work, whether it's with masks or with changing the way we greet each other and such. But basically, some social changes, and we're going to come back to work. When that happens, I think the companies that choose to come back physically are going to outperform the ones who don't.
Oh,
And so over time, you're going to see that. I think there's definitely going to be some churn and some changes. I think it's going to be a different world for companies like, talking about office space, for companies that are more in the WeWork phenomenon, where
right,
hey, we'll have one big table and we'll all sit at the table. I think those are going to spread out a lot and not quite have the same density that they used to have.
right.
That said, people still need that. Now, the other thing that I think is going to change is what I have found is that with a lot of people working from home, they have lost their professionalism. So you see people don't even dress up
Right.
for a meeting. There's no reason why if you're at home, you shouldn't act like it's a professional meeting. So you have people in t-shirts, you have kids running around, you have the dog barking, you have interruptions, and that lack of focus is going to put those people at a disadvantage. So people who truly have a medical condition and a reason are going to have to figure out how they isolate themselves from the rest of the noise in order to work.
Mhm.
And those who don't are going to get back into the office because they're just going to progress so much faster. Now, what I am afraid of, if I'm going to, I'm generally optimistic. I'm a little pessimistic in one sense, which is on the long-term future. I think that this pandemic is going to be very detrimental for the divisions in our society, because it really is going to give a big advantage to the children, especially who are in a wealthy enough household that they can have Wi-Fi and Zoom and a place to study and the ability to go to school,
Right.
versus the ones for whom school has either been canceled or they just can't participate at the same level because either their school doesn't have the technology or they don't have the access to technology at home. And so those kids, unfortunately, will be losing a year or two of competitiveness
Mhm.
where we had largely made up those gaps in public schooling versus private schooling in wealthier areas versus less affluent areas. And so that's purely demographic, not due to wealth. It's not due to class or race or gender or anything else. It's purely based on access to technology. And
Well,
so
that's kind of a socioeconomic issue, isn't it? Though, You
It
think
will be.
about it, and that divide is going to widen, is what I hear you saying. It's not going to close as it was doing with the integration of the schools. It's actually widening because of that lack of access.
Correct. And so I think, and I don't think that the United States is as well sensitized to that right now. Most of the push that you get is based on race, right? California just had a proposition with regards to affirmative action, trying to
Right.
put on, and you hear things about either race or gender as being the defining characteristics. But in my opinion, it's not really that. It's more socioeconomic
Right.
differences that are going to do it. And so the U.S. is not really well set up for that. And I think, unfortunately, the people who will be losing in that are people who don't yet have a voice, which is that younger generation who's going to find themselves a little bit disenfranchised if we don't help. And I think, unfortunately, the simple reaction is, well, just hold everybody else back. But
Right.
that's
No, 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 no.
not a good solution. And a lot of people will just solve that privately if they have the resources
Absolutely.
to.
Absolutely.
So the real better solution is finding a way to lift the people who don't have access and grant them access. And I
Right.
think this is one of those situations where, libraries and schools and areas, we have to recognize that there is almost no risk for the kids. There's risk to the teachers potentially, but
Hmm.
there's almost no risk to the kids. And so we are causing them a big disservice by not allowing them to go back to school.
That's a great point. In both arenas that you just talked about, the social side of work being an attribute that's important to the human body, will draw people back to work. They're the isolationists who have always been isolationists, but they tend to be individual contributors anyway, so they can work anywhere they want. So I agree with you that there is a social need for me to be someplace and be surrounded by people. I think best when I have the contributions of a broad set of inputs as opposed to my mere mind alone. And I know that. Now, I was a young stud that thought he could do everything when I was first started into business, and I learned real quickly that I had a nickname that wasn't a real nice nickname because I thought I was the brightest star in the sky. But I had a
Well,
boss who took care of me and said, Larry, you got to learn to work as a team. So I think that social piece, I think you're right on target there. That's going to drive people back into the office.
and if you look at places like Silicon Valley, if you're talking about a place that didn't need to exist in theory because, hey, we're all on the web and it's all technology, but that's not the case. That's one of the places where everybody is trying to get there so that they can participate in what in theory was going to be a very decentralized workplace.
Uh-huh.
And so I think that's a perfect example of people get pushed to do better stuff when they interact with other people.
I agree with you 100%.
You were getting back to the transparency conversation, or getting back to the transparency conversation that I mentioned before. It not only makes for better teams and better individual growth, but it also motivates people because everybody gets to see the results.
Yes. Yes.
If you do great, you are doing great in front of your peers. If you didn't do great, you didn't do so great in front of all your peers. So both of those are things that push you to do better and therefore push them to do better and therefore push you to do better. And that is very hard to do if you're not interacting directly with your peers.
That's a great perspective to have. And I really appreciate your opportunity to share all your thoughts and your experiences. I know my students are going to love this interview, Ori. And again, I want to thank you for volunteering to do this with me. It's been a real pleasure.
And it's a pleasure to meet you, and good luck to your students in their education. I can see that they're lucky to have you as an instructor.